Greetings, travelers. It's Mark Muncy, the author of Eerie, Florida, Freaky Florida, Creepy Florida, and now Eerie, Appalachia. So we are going to be traveling to some unique locations today as we further our lore in deep dives and journeys. And this time we're going to be traveling to the wild state of Ohio. Yes, the birthplace of more presidents than any other state. And but we're going to be talking about some of the unusual places that you may not know about there. First place we'll visit is a haunted train tunnel with a notorious reputation that actually caused some federal regulations to change. The second place and third place are tied together as some of the most interesting Native American sites of cultural significance that may tie in to our last location, which involves a certain monster of myth and lore. And then finally, we'll be rounding it out with a trip to Athens, Ohio, and the university there that was once a former lunatic asylum. So join us for this week's Eerie Travels. As we begin, we're going to first go to the town, well, some kind of not really a town. It was called Moonville. And Moonville was founded in the late 1800s, post-Civil War, and it was, the train lines were going through the area, and they needed to make it through from Pikeville to Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati was kind of the Chicago of its day. It was where everything shipped out on the Ohio River. And the trains went through, and this one man in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, named Coe, he offered his land for free to the railroad company if they would go through and allow him to dump his coal and offerings onto the train. So the train tracks were built. It is considered by many train drivers to have been the most treacherous train track ever, as it winds through the Ohio valleys and along the West Virginia border. And it's just this crazy place. Now, Moonville Tunnel was built because otherwise they would have to horseshoe around this giant ridge line. And it came across a trestle bridge and then through this tunnel. Now, in this tunnel, as you can see, it's still there today, was where a brakeman fell off the back of the train with his lights as he was signaling through. Now, he fell off and was hit by the next car and was decapitated. Now, his ghost was seen in that tunnel many, many times, to the point where they actually placed a light outside for CSX trains that later used this train when it was still active to not fall, because they kept braking because they kept seeing this strange light. So the brakeman himself caused federal authorities to put in a new light there. Now, the town itself was situated on both sides of the train tracks. And to call it a town is, a little generous. There was a few houses and a store, and that's where the town supposedly gets its name from, was the fact that the man who ran the store was named Moon. But we don't really have any records much of that town. We do know several people died crossing from one side of the tracks to another that got hit there. All that remains is the cemetery, a few telegraph poles, and the amazing Moonville Tunnel. It is being restored into a bike trail. They recently restored the trestle bridge outside, and you can go walk there. It takes a long drive to get to from the nearest town of Athens, but it is an amazing location and definitely a wonderful place for your Eerie Travels. And our next spot is quite interesting. We need to go a little ways away over to one of the most amazing creations by prehistoric man, and that is called Serpent Mound. Now, Serpent Mound is well known as one of the largest effigies effigy mounds in the world. Now, what an effigy mound is it's not really a burial mound. It's something that is built to look like an animal or something, and generally meant to be viewed from above. Most famously, the Nazca lines in Peru, and the horse mound in the horse carvings over in Cardiff. We're actually showing Alligator Mound. We're a little ahead of ourselves, but that's okay. I'm sorry, I may have jumped around. But these mounds were built to be things that signified special significance in their cultures. So Serpent Mound is built to look like a giant serpent, and it is with a coiled tail and a head that when the first American observers observed it, they thought it looked like the great serpent from the Bible, and it's eating an apple. So obviously this must be where the Garden of Eden is. And for those who have been around this area, it's a nice place, not necessarily the Garden of Eden. But what Native American lore has is they have a creature known as the Great Serpent. The Great Serpent rules the underworld. He is the devourer of souls. He is also just the guardian of the earth. And that's where all the serpents live in the earth, so of course. And he is known for having this large eye. So when we look at Serpent Mound from above, that head eating an apple, no, that's the eye of the Great Serpent. Now there's discussion on which of the natives built this mound. It's been studied for thousands of years and has never been confirmed which of the many cultures of Native Americans in this area were able to create it. But it's spectacular. It follows along a ridge of an old impact crater from a long ago meteor or asteroid. The coiled tail is very representative of Native American folklore and ties into another creature of legend, and that is the underwater panther, or Mishipishu, among the natives. And Mishipishu, the horned serpent, is known to live in the waters. So he is the guardian of the waters. And in fact, you weren't allowed to tell tales of Mishipishu during the warm months. You weren't allowed to talk about Mishipishu during the cold months when the waters were frozen, because you might summon his wrath. The natives would make offerings to Mishipishu when they would go out on the waters, and they would throw, offerings into the waters. Now, what's really unusual about this is there's another smaller mound that we showed just a few minutes ago, just a short difference away in the town of Granville, and that is called Alligator Mound. Now, alligators in Ohio, not very common, and certainly not amongst the indigenous peoples. So, again, hard to see except from above. It has 4 legs and a curly tail, and alligators generally don't have curly tails. Some people thought it might have been a raccoon or a possum. It's an unusual location to be sure. But what we think happened was the natives of the area would describe it as the underwater panther or the horned serpent. And it was this thing that lives in the water and has a big spiky tail, and it can kill you. And the early Eastern European settlers come into the area and go, oh, that's an alligator. It's not an underwater panther. Underwater panther doesn't make sense, as the name Mishipishu would have translated. Panthers don't live underwater, but they have more of a pug nose and has horns and a circular tail. Definitely not an alligator. But what those settlers would say is, no, all right, so that's an alligator. So the natives would think, oh, okay, well, your word for Mishipishu must be alligator. And so years down the line, as they were wiped out, people would still say, oh, the natives insisted that this was Alligator Mound. And so that's why we keep the name Alligator Mound instead of what we think is Mishipishu or the underwater panther, which makes a little more sense if you follow the history. Now, the mounds themselves, some people say, are only built to be observed from above, so it must have been aliens or ancient flying creatures that could see them. Well, they may have been built to appease the gods of above, like the natives who felt the thunderbirds ruled the sky, the serpent ruled below the earth, and the underwater panther ruled the waters. So maybe they were appeasing the thunderbirds, but we're not really sure. Now, what happens is a small town not far from there, it was called Crosswick. It's in Waynesville, Ohio nowadays. And Crosswick in the 1880s had an unusual situation happen. Some young boys were out playing, and they saw what they thought was large serpent-like creature in the nearby quarry. So they went over to investigate. Now there had been tracks reported of it. And these are all well documented in the newspapers of the time. And the boys went over to see what was there. And what they saw was a great snake with legs, supposedly rising up to 12 or 13 feet in height when it was alerted to the boys. And it grabbed one of the children in its teeth and fled at an alarming rate, faster than a horse, according to the other boy. There's Mishipishu from early cave paintings. And now this Crosswick serpent was, the other boy ran to get help. He got a priest and 2 soldiers who were there nearby working in the quarry. They came over to stop the monster and try to rescue it from the boy. They were unable to chase him away. There's the Smithsonian representation of the Crosswick serpent. They did manage to get the creature to drop the boy, and it ran up into a tree. So the men fled back into town to get all the other men in town to come chase this thing out of the tree. They came with axes, they came with pitchforks, they came with all these things. And as they attacked the tree, it fled. It jumped and leapt over the crowd and then ran again, faster than a horse, according to the articles, into a small cave. And there it went down deep into the earth where they could not get it. And they posted a watch there for several weeks. There was no further postings of it. Now, reading the initial descriptions of that monster, thinking about the underwater panther, thinking about Serpent Mound, the coily tail, the legs, the horns, the spiky back, it fits the description of Mishipishu. And Carrie Schultz, my wonderful wife and partner, did illustration of Mishipishu for our new book, Eerie Appalachia. And quite remarkable. And that's him hiding right here with a little bit of a glare. Sorry, Rob, but there he is in his fun detail. So try not to get the glare. There we go. But anyway, that's Mishipishu. So a short distance from that, however, back over to Athens near Moonville, we go back to an area known as the Ridges. Now the Ridges was an insane asylum, not done in the Kirkbride style that we've discussed in the past, but along those lines. It was a spread out complex. It was meant to be self-sufficient. The asylum inmates were able to grow their own crops and work out in the fields. Sadly, several thousand of them died there and are all left with markers that are just numbers. This is an area that was called Radar Hill because they used it as a radar installation for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base before the graves were restored. It is now part of the state university system. The buildings themselves are notoriously haunted, and most famously by that stain on the right. What happened is one of the inmates, towards late term in this asylum's lifetime, decided that she was just tired one day, and she went up into the attic area, took off all her clothes, and laid down and died. It was in the winter, so they say she might have died of frostbite. But It's unreally known what her real cause of death was, but they did not find her for several weeks. They had assumed she had escaped. And that stain is up there at the top of that building system, and they cannot get it out. Now, the buildings were abandoned for some time after its closure in the early 80s, and it fell into disrepair quite quickly, as you can see from these photos from a trip I took there back when I was in high school. And there's the stain. It's still there today, although they have restored the building now, and it is part of the state university system, and they use it for office. And that is allegedly the lady who passed away up there, although we cannot verify that photo, but it has been used many times to represent her. Now, mental health concerns are always, plaguing these old locations. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the Ridges, any of the Kirkbrides, Penhurst, and Waverly Hills, just to name a few. These buildings were built with the best care they could provide at the time, and it was open air. It was a nice place to relax, and they were very big with nature being a part of their therapy. These were not what you expect when you hear the term lunatic asylum, with padded rooms and all that. Now, they did have those facilities, and they did do experimental procedures at the time, including electroshock and water bathing and stuff like that, which nowadays would be considered very scary and very improper. But that does not, the places were still very useful for their time, and they did help a lot of people. Now, with modern therapy, we know more. What happened when the Ridges closed is they evicted all the patients. Just let them go. Same thing happened in Waverly Hills, where they could not find a place for them. Families wouldn't take them. They just were let loose. It caused tons of damage in the neighboring towns. People still wandered those lands for years, tending the gardens and trying to make a living in the ruins of the old asylums. So the Ridges, of course, has numerous ghost stories around it. The hills behind it with those graveyards that are just go on and on and on. But thankfully, they are being treated with the reverence they deserve and are being restored as best they can. Some of these facilities will never be completely restored. Penhurst Asylum is going to be bulldozing several of its buildings just because they are beyond repair and are no longer safe to even be near, while some areas are being restored. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is restoring floor by floor, but their prisoner area behind them, for people who were the bad guys who were sent there, those buildings will be demolished soon. So while you can, take your trip to these places, find these locations, get tours while you can. Not all of them are going to be fully saved like here at the Ridges. Some are going to fall into further disrepair. Thankfully, Waverly Hills has a foundation and they're being restored to an extent, but they're also an amazing place to get tours and to go on paranormal hunts. Trans-Allegheny also does paranormal tours and nights where you can rent the asylum. And of course, the Ridges, now that it's part of the Ohio University system, does not quite endorse that, but they will take you on tours and allow you to see the stain in the attic as part of their history tour of the historical parts of the Ridges. Now, the Kirkbride system was pretty much abandoned in the 1970s, but the asylums themselves stayed open for decades. And of course, overcrowding became an issue. They were no longer budgeted for. The governments were cutting funding for these things. And that's where the darker sides of these stories come in. That was when reporters would start going into these places and just seeing the squalid living conditions and the overcrowding and all that. That's what most people remember when they think of the Kirkbride museums. And it's sad and a little tragic. But that said, they did serve their purpose in their time. And who's to say a little R&R in a nice, beautiful manor house with open air and looking out at beautiful gardens wouldn't help anybody's mental health a little bit. So just could do without the electroshock, I think, for the most part. But anyway, this week's Eerie Travels, we went through some Native American lore, and I kind of wanted to talk about the monster more than the legend. But if you want to know more about the Adena culture, the Hopewell culture, and the mound builders that are still being debated to this day, the Fort Ancient culture, all this other stuff, you can contact Dr. Lepper at Ohio History, and he was the one who gave us the information for Alligator Mound and Serpent Mound for our book, Eerie Appalachia. He is also an expert on pre-Columbian culture, and he's also very good on the ice peoples, so the people from the Ice Age. That's his particular area of expertise. Now, the Crosswick Serpent and Mishipishu often are considered a possible tie for the Hodag in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, because they look very similar in depictions. It is also seen as a possible originator of some of the dinosaur or dragon legends we have. Now, they were supposedly all killed, the underwater panthers were all killed by the great thunderbirds, according to Cherokee lore. Now, is any of that real? Is any of that really happening? Perhaps, as we've discovered in the past, some of these legends are based in truth. Some of these things did happen. Some of these things could still happen. And it's quite scary when you look back on this stuff to think, what was the inspiration for that story? Now, the Crosswick Serpent newspaper article was just discovered in the year 2019. So this is an 1830s newspaper that was never archived and was finally being done by a student project in the area. So that's why we are so rushing to document stories, to document legends, because it could be lost. That story could have been lost to history. People knew Crosswick Monster, they'd heard the legend, but didn't know there was a newspaper article that tied all this in and had names, had dates, had the occurrence. Suddenly we had a different description which fit the Mishipishu lore. This is the kind of thing we ask everyone, please tell us your stories. Please share your stories more than just with your family. If you have a family legend, let us know about it. You can email me, mark@eerieflorida.com, or go to the Eerie Florida website. You can also go to the Eerie Travels website now, which has just gone live, and we can find you there. We'd love to tell your stories, but we can also steer you to the places that do specific recording. The Bigfoot Research Organization, MUFON for the UFO Network, the Mutual UFO Network, and others. We also reach out to local paranormal teams, local Bigfoot hunting teams, local UFO researchers, and we can steer you to the right people to contact so that they can investigate your sightings. Now, I don't care if this is a sighting from the 1940s your grandfather told you about. It's important for us to know, because then we can possibly verify it with other stories that happened in the same time, happened in the same area. That's what these organizations collect, these databases of stuff. And it's pretty amazing to see when you do that what comes up. I was recently reported a sighting of an unusual thing up in North Florida by a truck driver who had heard me on the radio or seen one of my shows and sent me an email describing this weird incident. And I filed it away. 2 weeks later, someone in the same area, a friend of mine, saw something very similar, messaged me, did not know the truck driver, didn't know even had that story, and now we have a full-on investigation team investigating that, and that creature is for another week, and I will be talking about him soon. But in the meantime, we really appreciate your time with us, as we always do. If there's a specific place you'd like us to talk about or a place to investigate, let us know. Comment, follow us at Eerie Travels or at Eerie Florida. Either one gets to me. I appreciate it, and we appreciate all the likes and views. Share with your friends, get the word out. Let them know you can find us on YouTube, on WeBeam. You can find us a lot of fun places. And one last little note. We really want to thank Destiny Beard for giving us the wonderful theme song that we have now. It's a gift that just keeps on giving. Every week I hear it, and it's amazing. And if you can follow her at Destiny Beard Music, she'd appreciate it. And her family, her father's Ed Beard and the art of Ed Beard. He drew for Magic the Gathering and draws for Dragon Magazine back in the day, and a lot of other great fantasy illustrations. His picture of Lord Soth, for those old Dragonlance or Ravenloft fans, is iconic. And they could use some help right now. So please like and listen to their stuff on Spotify. Follow Ed Beard at his Patreon. They would appreciate any help they can get. It's been a rough year for a lot of artists, and we understand that, being artists ourselves. So we will see you at a convention soon, or you can find us here on the show as always. And if you see that strange thing out of the corner of your eye, if you hear that weird noise, or if you're just looking off into the distance and see something you don't quite understand, try to take a picture. At the very least, try to get a mental picture as clear as you can of what happened, where you saw it, why you saw it, what you thought you saw. Get that description to the right people, and we will see you on the other side.